Good evening, everyone, or buenas noches a todos. Thank you for joining us. We're very excited to have you here, and we have an amazing panel here joining us as well. My name is Maggie Landeros. I am one of the co-chairs for the Los Angeles chapter of the UC Berkeley Chicanx Latinx Alumni Association. I'm very proud to be surrounded by all these wonderful people as the proud granddaughter of two grandfathers who partook in the Bracero program and a father who also served as a field worker for many years upon his immigration here to the States. So this is very near and dear to my heart. So I'm excited for all of us to be able to experience this, and we hope that you enjoy this evening.
Thank you, Rosemary Maggie. My name is Max Ochoa, Cavers in the Desert Board Vice President. Thank you very much for coming to a special screening of To Live for the Harvest. A brief introduction of the OC World. OC World is a nonprofit multimedia company whose mission is to provide residents with critical information and to learn more about their communities and to provide them with the opportunity to make informed decisions. Their leadership team includes Scott Hay, a producer, and Dr. Manuel Gomez, who served as the Vice Chancellor of Student Affairs at the University of California, Irvine. Among many, many other leadership roles, Dr. Gomez is now a co-producer with OC World. The documentary To Live for the Harvest explores the early agricultural roots of Orange County and investigates reasons and factors determining the disproportionate impact COVID-19 has on farm workers and their families. Our hope is that tonight's event will be a motivation to engage in meaningful conversation on how to best identify, address through a collective process, how to engage and work with vulnerable communities. As we recover from the pandemic, it is important to acknowledge, but more importantly, to know why there is unequal pandemic impact on these communities.
So thank you, Max, and thank you, all of you, for being with us this evening. Out of respect, just quickly, for our Indigenous ancestors and to combat American amnesia, denial, and historical distortions, I have made it a practice to begin every program with a land acknowledgement of our Indigenous ancestors and their surviving nations on this land that we stand on. So let's take one moment with me to recognize the Ahashamen Nation who lived along the coast of Orange County, the Cahuilla Nation and the Agua Caliente Band who lived inland in the Coachella Valley, and the Salinan and Ohlone nations of the Salinas Valley in today's Monterey County. Thank you for taking this moment to acknowledge our Indigenous ancestors. So I'd like to get down to it and start right away with Dr. Barsaga and put a question to him. So, hello, Dr. Barsaga. You are your knowledgeable insights into the pandemic's impacts on the lives of farm workers really helped us tell the story, as you could tell now from the documentary. But I want to ask you, since that time, 2 years now, have things really gotten better or have they gotten worse? And connected to that, what are the public health needs for these working families that you are still seeing are not being met today?
There are some things that have changed, and I have to say primarily they have more visibility. They have become more visible to our community, to institutions like the Desert Healthcare District. We're working to bring more services, more programs, better resources, or more resources to the communities where farm workers work and live with their families. But there are things that have not changed, and I believe it's important that we mention them. Racism is a public health crisis. We say it time and time again every time we see a Black individual being killed by the police, but we have thousands of farm workers that are dying every year thanks to the immigration policies that are used as a tool of oppression to our people because of the race. We cannot forget that racism is what has created the immigration policies we have in place in this country, and that bring these community members into a status of invisibility, of silence, because they cannot raise their voices. So those are things that have not changed, and I hope that we all can work together to elevate the visibility and importance of changing that policy. We have had this effort to bring resources into the farm worker community, and the pandemic demonstrated that without their work, we could not nurture ourselves, because supermarkets would be empty of goods because we need the farm workers, and they never stopped working during the pandemic when everybody else took a pause and could work, as I mentioned in the documentary, via Zoom. They could not zoom into the field. They had to work every day to provide the goods that we were buying at the supermarket and the food that was nurturing people at the hospital and the doctors and the nurses and the patients and everybody in nursing homes.
And move to Professor Christian Pais, if I may. I'd like to ask you, Dr. Pais, so how has the history of the Bracero program influenced the current living and working conditions of farm workers? And connected to this process, of the several challenges facing farm workers today, what do you see as the number one priority needed to secure improvements in the daily lives of these essential workers?
And so, one of the things that in our conversations, I noted that historians have a difficult time talking about policies today. And but what I shared with you in my interviews with the people that I spoke to in the Coachella Valley, they emphasized repeatedly immigration reform. So what the Dr. Barzaga is noting is quite evident. Not having documentation not only makes you invisible to a lot of the people in our communities or in their country, but it also makes it hard for you to negotiate with state agencies, with employers, with schools, with your neighbors. So immigration reform would go a long way to negotiate some of the relationships that are taking place both in the workplace and outside of the workplace, because they're quite interlinked. If we want any more policies, I mean, a few more would be public investments in these communities, healthcare resources, education resources, housing resources, parks. I mean, just the most basic of things. I live in Berkeley. There are so many parks all around me. There's an absurdity to the situation that's taking place in places like the East Coachella Valley, where the only green space are the fields where people are working. So those are some changes that could take place. As to the question about the Bracero program, it's a complicated question. The Bracero program that goes from 1942 to 1964 is repeating what is taking place today, which is that it sees people as assets that can be used for labor and then removed. So while the grower tutor talks about his need to work with people and that hence why he needs to treat them better, people aren't assets. People are people, and that requires that we think about what people need beyond the very labor that they're expending in the fields. So the Bracero program is the epitome of that. People can, the men come to work for una temporada, for a small contract. They live in the most basic conditions possible, and then they leave once the contract is done. And the contract stipulations are completely controlled by growers in the United States. So that dynamic in some ways is working in a very informal way when people are do not have any legal standing in this country.
Thank you for that, Dr. Pais. That's really very insightful information. I'd like to ask you one other question. As a person who grew up in Termal,
sure,
and was able to overcome the obstacles, obviously, and you attended the university, became a professor now at UC Berkeley, and when you work with students, what encouragement or advice would you convey to these young students, young people who are still in Termal, in Mecca, in North Shores, these little communities that have very little opportunity structures? How would you interest them in continuing their education so that they can become leaders in their own communities?
Oftentimes my students at Berkeley they feel like there's a tension between how they can serve their communities and what they wish to do in their lives, what moves them. And what I usually tell my students is that we need everybody to get involved. We need doctors, we need filmmakers, we need professors, we need environmentalists who do work on the environment, we need lawyers, we need housing designers, we need musicians, we need every single conceivable human being to do whatever it is that moves them and then to share it to the collective. It is hard, I think, in some ways to speak to the younger kids who are dealing with such profound disparities and speak about grit, so for me is whoever has any resources available to them, you need to start sharing them like now, right? And people are, and that's the most moving thing. Because there were obstacles, but I grew up in a incredible family. My mother was, going to every single school meeting. My father led Little League Baseball. My neighbors, I grew up in public housing, but whenever a new neighbor would come in, oftentimes people didn't have any furniture. And I swear, every single person would take out their extra couch, which apparently every Mexican family had, or their extra table, or their extra whatever, Tupperware. And by the end of the evening, people had a pretty livable home. And so there were disparities, and I see them more the more money that I get, or the more my position has shifted. I see the disparity a lot more. But I also there were things that I can rely on, and those are the things that move me to make sure that I'm doing the work that I should be doing.
I'd like to turn to Melina Duarte, but continuing this line of discussion with regard to the inequities and the disparities of the communities that we are talking about right now. Melina, you were born in Coachella Valley, and you also left for the university education, and you've returned. And now I would like to ask you, how do you see, now that you've got this education behind you, how do you see things differently in your own hometown now that you are back home and you're from when you were growing up in this town? And I want you to connect that response to, can you also tell us what are some of the fundamental disparities with regard to internet access, computer literacy, et cetera, that may have prevented farm workers and families and communities from actually even obtaining the kind of public health services that they needed?
So having returned to the Coachella Valley after being away for a really long time, as an adult, I do see this valley in a very different lens than when I left. I've always been very connected to the work here, to a lot of things that are happening here. I never fully left. Wherever I was, I've always brought Coachella with me. If there are programs that are wanting to be started or piloted, I always offer Coachella. So having been back, I saw the huge disparities that still exist. Growing up here, you don't see it, you're in it. You don't understand the differences in economic statuses across the valley, even 5-10 miles away from your house. As an adult, you see it, and you see where the pockets are, and you see the policies that are in place to keep pockets in certain areas. So I think one of the things that I really saw was the county rolled out the vaccine initiatives, and you had to sign up. The spots were pretty much out in the first 5-10 minutes. How do you expect a farm worker, an older person, or viejitos to sign up online? Even though they were eligible, those spots were gone. So there was a huge disconnect in the technology, even with our adults, on how to sign up. So we created a system where everything was via text message. We could send a message in English and in Spanish, and being able to implement those systems to use and make things easier for the communities that were here was just a huge, an honor for me to be able to tie those things and teach other promotoras and other people that I was working with how to implement technologies for the betterment and the ease, to make things easy for our communities and getting them the services they needed.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Melina. I'm going to turn now to Assemblyman Rivas. Okay, Assemblyman Robert Rivas, as chair of the Agricultural Committee, and really what's so beautiful, as you noted, his grandfather was a bracero. And here we have an individual whose grandfather was a bracero, who's the chair of the Agricultural Committee in Sacramento. The poetic justice of that just is amazing. Thank you a lot for that, Assemblyman Rivas. So as a chair, what key lesson did you learn regarding the California efforts to address the health needs of farm workers during the pandemic crisis last year, or the last couple of years? And will you be able to also, in connection to this, share with us your 2022 legislative priorities related to meeting the continuing challenges facing farm workers and their families in California?
Absolutely. Well, appreciate the opportunity to be with you all, and And Doctor, it's great to see you. And I, really appreciate you mentioning, my appointment as the chair of Ag Committee in the State Assembly. I'm very thankful to Speaker Anthony Rendon for giving me that opportunity. And I think, to be absolutely clear, this is my 4th year as a member of the California State Assembly. And the very first bill I introduced as a new member of the California State Legislature back in 2019 was Assembly Bill 1783. It was the Farm Worker Housing Act of 2019. And the reason I mention that, because for me, it didn't take an unprecedented global pandemic to begin to advocate for and fight for California's farm workers, and for their families. Like so many other Latinos here in our state, I come from an immigrant farm working family. And in fact, in California's 172-year history, I'm the very first California State Assembly member to have lived and grown up in migrant farm worker housing, and now chair and lead the Assembly Agriculture, the committee. And so it's very special, but really my focus has always been on those values that were instilled in me by my immigrant farm working family, to always fight for the most vulnerable in our society, the most vulnerable here in our state, in the district I represent, which are our farm workers. We have the opportunity and we have the capacity as a state, one of the most affluent states in the entire world, to do a lot more for our farm workers and for their families here in California. We have to keep in mind that here in our state, we have been a worldwide leader in the agriculture industry. It's an industry that has worked to ensure that we provide food on tables, not only here in the state and across the country, but really around the world. And ultimately, it's because of our state and our agriculture that we have allowed and have maintained the world's food supply chain. And farm workers, as we know, as we heard throughout the documentary, have always been the backbone to our agricultural productivity and our success. And they deserve better because we know that farm workers, their families, are an incredibly vulnerable workforce and population, largely undocumented, an immigrant workforce who have faced racism, have been underappreciated, faced some marginalization, face extreme income inequality, and many other structural some disparities, as we've already heard by members of the panel, around access to dignified and affordable housing, adequate access to healthcare. And so this year, I think what you can expect from our office is our continual focus to focus on many of these policy areas and issues that impact our farm workers every day: access to clean water. A second area is certainly doing all we can to mitigate the impacts of this climate crisis that it's having on our farm workers, in the way of these unprecedented wildfires, just the constant exposure to toxic air quality conditions because of these fires, excessive heat. And then third is housing. We heard it in the documentary. I mentioned it. I grew up in migrant farm worker housing, overcrowded housing. I can remember how challenging it was to grow up in that environment, how challenging it was to focus and study and do homework. And I had it back then, but now, our farm working families today and children, they have it much, much worse. And so, we're going to continue to push to try to secure some dollars in the state budget to construct farm worker housing. But the main purpose of our work this year is going to be trying to understand and quantify this problem. There's such a lack of data. We know that farm worker housing is a crisis in the state. It's a humanitarian crisis. Many of our farm working families who they live in third world country conditions, which is absolutely unacceptable in a state like California, and we've got to fix that. And so trying to work and commission a statewide farm worker housing study so we have a baseline to work from, and so we can ensure that we can do more to solve this urgent problem.
Wow, Assemblyman Rivas, that was really great, and also really good to learn about your ongoing new priorities for 2022. And I'd like to turn to Conrado Barzaga, and actually I have a two-part question for you again, Dr. Barzaga, and then you were educated in Cuba. You worked in Latin American countries. So I'd like to give you an opportunity to briefly just share a few of the possible insights that you may have of a comparative nature to what you experience as a doctor in those countries and what your experience has been in the Coachella Valley. And connected to this, I would like to see if you could comment a little bit on the importance of cooperation or collaboration across sectors to address the needs of farm workers.
Thank you, Manuel. In my working in Latin American countries, especially in Cuba and Bolivia, I saw similar conditions because farm labor and that type of work leads to those conditions of labor. However, there were some very clear distinctions, both in Cuba and in Bolivia, where I worked with similar populations. They had a sense of belonging that it's very difficult for the farm workers' labor that we have, or workforce that we have here in the United States because of the immigration status. That creates a separation. It creates a new conditions of slavery that we don't see in other countries, and that is very sad. That is a great distinction that I have to make. And the other thing that makes it different is that we have here in the United States, and this is on the positive lens, we have a rich civic participation of so many not-for-profit organizations that contribute to the well-being of so many different groups. And that has been one of the greatest assets we have had in this work here in the Coachella Valley. Yes. I have to start by mentioning that one of the greatest assets we have had has been Alejandro Espinosa, who is also showcased in the documentary. Being a Coachelano, he's someone from the land who knows exactly the territory. He knows who is who, and he knows exactly who to work with. And I have to mention Visión y Compromiso, Alianza Coachella Valley, Pueblo Unido, Youth Leadership Institute, Líderes Campesina, TODEC, El Sol, all those organizations which are non-profit, community-based organizations here in the Coachella Valley joined us in the effort and created the Coachella Valley Equity Collaborative. And the wealth of knowledge, the deep understanding of the different communities in the valley, their ability to see through their eyes, to know their culture, their language, and as somebody mentioned, they don't. In some cases, they don't even speak Spanish. We have communities that speak Purépecha, so we had to reach out to that sub-segment of our population. That it's very important because most of them are farm workers. We have to highlight that in January of 2021, we were vaccinating farm workers. And we know that we were probably the first community in the United States that began vaccinating farm workers, realizing, understanding, and acknowledging that they were an essential workforce to sustain the economy of California, but also of the United States, because food was needed. And all those organizations were very successful and very helpful in creating those conditions and building the infrastructure that allowed us to work in different communities throughout the Coachella Valley to vaccinate, to provide other resources, and to help protect this valuable workforce and this valuable community.
Thank you for that beautiful, comprehensive analysis. I'd like to respond a little bit to some of the chats. So thank you for all the individual responses to the ongoing discussion and particularly the documentary. One point I have to make, yes, the singer is Rosa Zarate Macías, Rosa Marta Zarate Macías, La Señora del Canto. She's a wonderful singer. That was one of the questions I was asked. But also I'd like to convey her message, which is, somebody said, La lucha continúa. For sure, the struggle continues. But most people may not know that the Bracero struggle that ended in 1964 officially actually is continuing. they were robbed of their salary savings that was a requirement of the Bracero contract. They were taken out of their salaries every month, 10%. It was a beautiful program so that when they would return, they'd have 10% like a pension. They never received it. They got ripped off. So that struggle is ongoing. I want everyone to know. And I said that I suspect that over 70% of people from Mexican background were connected to farm workers as we are. And so that this documentary is very moving and very important to all of us. But I don't think we cannot measure our progress by their continued marginalization as our community. In fact, I think there may be a mirror of our actual powerlessness, though we look more powerful when we look at our farm workers, but in fact, we are one community that continues to remain invisible in the political discourse of our country. And we need to do something about that. We also are aware of a major kind of national political polarization crises related to the news, related to factual information. So-called, now we argue between what is fake and what is real. I just want to conclude with you by saying that if you're interested in these kinds of stories, if you want to support these kinds of stories, please follow us on ocworld.org. We need help, we need support, and we need volunteers. And also, I think we need to attack this issue of creating information that creates bonds rather than having the information distribution divide us into and fracture us into more and more divisions, which is what more or less is happening now with even our corporate news. Everybody's in a bubble. We may be in a bubble too, but our bubble has to grow and become connected to much other bubbles to go with Max's collaboration theme.
Thank you all very, very much. We definitely want to be mindful of everyone's time, but first I want to give everyone on the panel a big thank you on behalf of Cal Bears in the Desert, the Chicanx Latinx Alumni Association, the California Alumni Association, and everyone here present. Thank you for your insight. Thank you for sharing your personal stories and how personal this work is. This has to be or feel personal to some extent, in whatever way we can connect to continue to really drive this forward. So we're really, really thankful to all of you. We also want to extend our gratitude to all of the folks who joined us this evening and those who are going to watch this recording in the near future. And we hope that you see the urgency that is needed to really mobilize and support everyone who is connected by in some way or another to our farm worker community. So again, thank you. We will continue to post information on the Cal Bears and the Desert.org site, and we'll post it in the chat right now. So please continue to monitor the website for updates, as well as connect with us in any way, shape, or form as we continue again to come together and really create space, not just for dialogue, but create space for mobilization as we support it from worker communities.